Hi everyone, Professor King here. I swear my laptop camera is like the picture of Dorian Gray, except instead of the image getting older, it just gets fuzzier every single time. It's driving me insane. I actually had an older laptop before this from 2013, super old, I know, that had a great camera and it died on me in April, right in the middle of all the beginning quarantine stuff, which was really fun. And then I got this one and, I look like a stick figure. Like I just look like a blob in this. So I'm really sorry about the quality. If I had, got a little more money, I'd maybe buy like a little better camera or something. But I appreciate you all sticking with it. And these web teaches are mostly the PowerPoints anyway. So who cares about this old mug, right? Anyway, I'm going to get started. Today we're talking about Audre Lorde's Age, Race, Class, and Sex, Women Redefining Difference. This is a great companion to reading Crenshaw. It's going to be, for most of you, it's going to be much more accessible than Crenshaw, not just because it's a lot shorter, but one of Audre Lorde's beautiful gifts that we are just so lucky to have as descendants and followers and people who came after, people who get to consume her legacy, if you will, is just how wonderfully direct and clear and simple yet brilliant the things that she says are. So much of what we've been reading this semester is this highly dense, jargony, theoretical language. And Audre Lorde just has a way of saying things where you're just like, oh my gosh, like how did that not get said before in such a, like I said, such a direct, clear, beautiful way? That's because she's a genius, right? And we're lucky that she ever graced this earth. So I really hope you enjoyed this reading. And that, if Crenshaw was a little difficult for you, definitely a lot of these concepts that Lorde talks about that actually predate Crenshaw by about a decade. I hope they help to clarify. And if nothing else, you have all these rad quotes that you can use, because that's one of the great things about reading English and reading literature and reading theory is, it's kind of like being a music nerd. You can just like pull these quotes out and say them, right, and cite them in polite or impolite dinner conversation. So I'm really excited to talk about this. So we'll get started. I'll take it to the share screen and we will talk the genius of Audre Lorde. And some of you may have seen Audre Lorde's name, maybe like on, quotes on Instagram or something. A very, very heavily requoted individual, especially right now with a lot of the things that are going on in our society. This particular essay, I believe, was written in 1980, published in 1980. And, still so much of it, all of it really is applicable to what we're seeing today in 2020. So 40 years later, and this could have been written yesterday. So that's Audre Lorde there. And I won't go into too much biographical depth because Lorde actually gives us a lot of that within the context of this essay. So we'll just get going right away. Because Lorde just is such a master of language, I didn't want to fuss this PowerPoint up with too many images because we don't need them. We don't need a picture to kind of further explain what she's talking about, because again, it's just so well articulated and so just simply and wonderfully rendered. Can you tell I like this, by the way? I hope you do too. So I just want you to consider some of these quotes as you are not only wrapping up the novel, but again, just thinking about the world as a text, thinking about the various things that go on in our society, in other societies, and how we can, what we can do with that information. So this first quote on pages 114 and 115, those page numbers are from an old PDF. So I'll just delete them so you don't have to worry about them, because I know this version that we have is a web page, so it doesn't have page numbers. So I'll just change those really quickly. Look at me and my horrible use of punctuation. What an expert. Okay, so the first one is, Lorde says there's a constant drain of energy which might be better used in redefining ourselves and constructing the future, as a result of it being the responsibility of the oppressed to teach the oppressor their mistakes, right? Like, Lorde is frustrated, is acknowledging the frustration of, this sort of issue with the oppressors expecting the oppressed to teach the oppressors their mistakes. She's essentially saying, like, that's BS, right? Like, why is that the way that it is in our society? It causes a drain of energy, which might be better used in redefining ourselves, right? In reconstructing or constructing the future. In other words, not to keep these patterns of oppression going. Later on, and I don't know if I mentioned this one or not, but later on, she has this great quote about sort of like, just because we're calling it something different or dressing it differently slightly does not mean we're not like doing the same oppressive, repeating the same sort of oppressive patterns. I just feel like you could quote this, like almost every single sentence of this. You could just like, it's a highlighter's dream. And then the next one, she says, we have no pattern for relating across our human differences as equals. Because of these imbalanced power relationships, be they according to gender, race, class, ability, language, country of origin, etc., right? We don't have a platform or a paradigm through which we can really interact with one another as equals. We're so programmed to interact with one another on a hierarchy. And I know that a lot of people will sit there and say, oh no, but like, I don't feel that way. I see everyone as equals. We don't, right? Like, our society does not. If it did, it would be a utopia. And clearly, if anyone is reading anything about politics any day of the week, it's clearly not. So, we have to acknowledge that. She goes on to say, those of us who stand outside of power identify one way. We are different, and we assume that to be the primary cause of all oppression, forgetting other distortions around distance, some we may be practicing. Now, this is a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people, right? Because, and it really sucks. And it even goes back to like Althusser, and it goes back to some of the other readings we've done. It sort of prepares us for Crenshaw in this idea that, it's not just that there's this sort of like oppressor-oppressed relationship, and the oppressor is the only one doing bad stuff, and the oppressed is a perfect victim, so to speak, right? The oppressed, like, we've bought into this, and we are practicing and engaging in some of these oppressions. Even though we stand outside of power, we are still upholding the power structure through our thoughts, our actions, our beliefs, our behaviors, etc. And a large part of this, one thing that Lorde repeats a couple times throughout this piece, is this idea that refusing to recognize difference makes it impossible to see the different problems and pitfalls facing us. And again, Crenshaw 10 years or so later is going to repeat this in her discussions of intersectionality, right? If we don't account for that difference, that variance, that variety, either within a group, within an individual, within a society, whatever, right? If we don't account for that, nothing is going to change. Because, right, and this is where Lorde takes it kind of biographical. She has this wonderful way of weaving her biographical, experience, her personal experience with these very complex theoretical concepts. Like, I can't stress enough how insanely difficult it is what Lorde is doing. Like, we read it and we go, oh, she said it so easily, like, easy, right? No. Think of your own writing and how hard it is to articulate complex ideas plainly, clearly, succinctly, in ways that just get to the heart of what people are thinking about. That takes so much craft and so much genius. Like, it's just a perfect storm of working at this craft, perfecting this craft of writing, but also having this innate talent for it. And this just, oh gosh, I just can't get enough of this, really. Anyway, she says, I'm constantly being encouraged to pluck out some aspect of myself and present this as the meaningful whole, eclipsing or denying the other parts of self. Again, if we think about Crenshaw, Crenshaw clearly is influenced by this, right? This idea of like synecdoche, right? Like this sort of like identity synecdoche. That'd be a cool band name. Like one aspect of our identity representing the whole of us, this categorization that is very essentialist and limiting and not accounting for, again, the complexity of human experience, the complexity of human interaction, et cetera, et cetera. And again, like I've asked before, whom does that serve? Whom does it serve when, and I'm not speaking necessarily for myself, but whom does it serve if we as the oppressed, because I won't go there. Whom does it serve if the oppressed have to only show one small part of themselves or big part, but not the whole thing? Does it serve them? No, they have to negate these other parts, right? It serves whatever that source of power is that seeks to dehumanize and make one-dimensional and render invisible the oppressed. Think back to Said, right? If the Oriental, right, is only this exoticized, sexualized other, that doesn't serve that doesn't serve the person from Asia, the Asian American, the person with complex personhood who wants to be seen as a full individual, right? It serves the Western white cis heteropatriarchal person who is presenting that image to us. So Lorde's, again, a lot of these theories now we're starting to see the kind of web that old Kinger has weaved in having us read these. I didn't weave this web. This web was woven when I came, right? I'm just like a big lazy spider that's slowly crawling around this web and hopefully eating a lot of flies. Anyway, let's go on. The next one, Lorde says, we must use each other's differences to enrich our visions and our joint struggles. And I'm just going to change these page numbers again because I'm nuts. Here we go. So we must use each other's difference to enrich our visions and our joint struggles. Again, gee, I wonder where Crenshaw got some of these ideas from, right? And that's not to say that Crenshaw is like, oh, she's ripping off Audre Lorde. Like, Audre Lorde needs to be ripped off, right? Like, this stuff needs to be taken from a platform of theory or of literary theory or philosophical inquiry and brought to sociology and brought to history and brought to the social sciences, right? And brought to literature, clearly, because that's what we're talking about here. But yeah, so using each other's differences to enrich our visions and our joint struggles instead of this, the sort of mythical ideal that she talks about, that white cis patriarchal sort of ideal that society tells us we are, however far removed from, if we're not that. We need to, you know and I don't even know if Lorde would say embrace difference, because that's become such like a, you know, kumbaya sort of way of looking at this. And it's sort of a, it's a way, it's a way for the power source to hijack these conversations and say, no, right? Like, let's embrace each other. It's like, no, let's use each other's difference to enrich our vision. We have to look at each other as equals. We have to get rid of these hierarchies based on identity markers. And we have to acknowledge and utilize those differences so that, again, we can overcome the struggles. The world can be egalitarian truly, right? And everyone's vision can be enriched if they so choose, right? And then that conclusion where Lorde talks about all of these great things, right? Like that, the very famous line of the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, right? This is where that comes from. And so to think about, like, how do we get out of that framework? How do we get out of that paradigm? How do we go from the way we've always thought about things and not just put like a corporate capitalist logo on it, right? Like, if you if you remember Pride Month, like now in recent years, Pride Month is all about, like, every single advertisement you see, it's like the same product, but like they slap a rainbow on it. And it's like, oh, we're LGBTQ friendly. We've totally solved the problem of, heterosexism, right? Of transphobia and homophobia and all these things, right? Like, no, we're doing the same old patterns, but trying to put a more progressive face on them, but really it's the same thing, right? And so Lorde is saying, as long as these hierarchies exist, as long as we refuse to recognize difference, as long as we don't treat one another truly as equals, as long as this mythical ideal exists, as long as the master's house exists, and we're trying to use the master's tools to dismantle it, nothing is going to change. We have to engage in a sort of revolutionary change, and we do it by starting, with these recommendations from Audre Lorde. So let's think about this in terms of the novel, in terms of the ending of Eva Luna, because now, right, we've seen the whole thing, right? And there's this passage from Lorde, and I, as you can tell, I cut and pasted this myself because it looks like garbage. I'm an English professor, not a graphic designer, so whatever. But Lorde talks about the creation of literature. And in this paragraph, she says, as white women ignore their built-in privilege of whiteness and define woman in terms of their own experience alone, then women of color become other, the outsider whose experience and tradition is too, quote unquote, alien to comprehend. Again, we've got Said there, we've got Crenshaw there, we've got any number, we've got Spivak there, et cetera, et cetera. An example of this is the signal absence of the experience of women of color as a resource for women's studies courses. The literature of women of color is seldom included in women's literature courses, or in any courses, any literature courses really, and almost never in other literature courses, as she says it, nor in women's studies as a whole. All too often, the excuse given is that the literatures of women of color can only be taught by colored women, or that they are too difficult to understand, or that classes cannot, quote, get into them because they come out of experiences that are, quote, too different. I've heard this argument presented by white women of otherwise quite clear intelligence, women who seem to have no trouble at all teaching and reviewing work that comes out of the vastly different experiences of Shakespeare, Molière, Dostoevsky, and Aristophanes. Surely there must be some other explanation, right? If I, as a white woman, can teach Shakespeare, who was a white man living 400 years before me, and call that a universal experience, how can I then not teach Isabel Allende or Toni Morrison or Zora Neale Hurston or Audre Lorde or Kimberly Crenshaw, right? Like, how can I not teach these things and use that same line of logic and say these are universals, right? It's because of these power dynamics, right? It's because there is, and the part that Lorde talks about, you know, where white women think that, you know, they're, because they are white, that they need to like sort of kowtow to the white patriarchal standard and align themselves with that, and how that's not really going to help anybody ever, other than, you know, right, the white cis hetero patriarchy. This is part of that, right? This is saying that, you know, why not the literature of women of color? Well, you know, because of the racial hierarchy, the embedded racial hierarchy in our society that we want to pretend doesn't exist, right? And so think about this. Think about what you have read. You know, now we're in chapter 11 of Babyluna. Think about what you've read in this novel. This is a novel written by a woman of color, in a society that's not America, dealing with characters that come from a variety of walks of life, and, you know, class, race, gender, sexuality, ability, status, et cetera, et cetera. Does this novel not reflect the universal human experience, the universal human condition, right? So we have to think about that, especially when we confront, right, things like the canon that we talked about with Eliot and with Morrison. We have to think about this when we confront the problematic aspects that we find out about in terms of our writers, right? We have to confront this in our college classrooms, because there is this embedded notion in some college classrooms, right, that you know, there's a presumption of quality tied to certain literatures and not others, right? And so we have to interrogate that. We have to interrogate those hierarchical structures when we are looking at literature. And I hope part of the reason why I assigned this novel is because I hope that allows us to do that, right? It allows us to interrogate those structures that are embedded in really all societies. All right, I'll move on. But before you get there, you might need to do a little review. So here's what you should know by the time you finish the novel, right? First off, who's dating Senor Arabena, right? Like everyone turns into a 13-year-old again when we talk about like who's dating this person, even if it's in a fictitious, you know, diegetic world of literature. What are the grenades made out of? And again, if you read, you'll know what I mean by that. Who's now married to a 14-year-old? And that whole discussion, right? Like when you read that part about the person who's married to the 14-year-old. And perhaps some age-related boundary crossing, we'll say, that person has engaged in previously, but also how that is portrayed by Ava Luna, right? How that is explained by the author speaking through our narrator. Like, I really want you to think about that. Like, I really want to, know your thoughts on that, because it's a tricky one, right? And then finally, where does Ava end up at the end of the novel? Because again, if we go back to day one, where I talked about this being a picaresque novel, the picaresque novel ends open-endedly. And this ending, Ava ends up in a specific place. Like a lot of times in picaresque fiction, it's like, oh, and I just kept traveling and, poking at windmills and, whatever, right? But Ava does end up somewhere at the end of this novel, Hazley, right? So we can find out where that is. All right. And then finally, let's think about Crenshaw and Lorde to our reading of the ending. And if we talk about a lot of our theorists who come from a Marxist tradition, and no, that does not mean that they are Antifa, relax, right? Like, put the QAnon down, please. If we apply a Marxist reading or a Marxist inspired reading to this novel, which includes, writers like Gramsci, which includes aspects of Lorde, aspects of a lot of Althusser, aspects of Foucault, of Butler, of Gordon, who we'll read in a couple weeks. Like so many of these writers, right? We're talking about conflict, because when we're talking about societies, we're talking about power relationships. When we're talking about power relationships, we are inevitably talking about conflict, right? Until everyone is equal, we don't have a utopia. And if we don't have a utopia, we've got conflict, right? So I want you to think about conflict as it plays out in this novel, particularly with, and I don't necessarily mean like war, right? Or like slapping fights or something like that. Like conflict can just be like, weirdness or issues or, bad vibes between characters. It can be any number of things. So let's apply Crenshaw and Lorde specifically, since that's where we are this week, to our reading of the novel. So first question is, why do you think Mimi approaches conflict the way she does? As a trans woman, as an ex-convict, etc. All of those identity marks. And when I say ex-con, I should really say formerly incarcerated person. Ex-con is like, I feel like I'm like writing for a 70s cop show or something. Okay. Why do you think Rolf Carley approaches conflict the way he does, as a foreigner, as a trauma survivor? If you've ever heard the term gentle masculinity, right? Like maybe that kind of language can play into the way that Rolf approaches conflict, especially if you think about his father, right? And kind of the contrast there between Rolf and his father. You have to go back a few chapters, but it's a small book, no biggie. And then why do you think Ava approaches conflict the way she does, as a biracial orphan living in transience, right? Finally, why do you think Huberto approaches conflict the way he does, as a man of color who came from poverty? And again, thinking about maybe like masculinity, toxic masculinity, gentle masculinity, how all of these identities, all of these walks of lives, all of these complex human experiences are embedded within each one of these characters, and how that makes them come to life, and how that, again, informs not only how they deal with conflict, but how the novel progresses and what happens within the novel. Because there's a lot going on. There's a lot we can you can play around with, right? So I think that's it. Yeah, that's it. So I hope this helped. I'll take it off stop share now so that you can just see my like blob fuzzy face again. I hope this helped. I hope everyone has if you have any questions or comments or concerns, always feel free to contact me, Canvas, email, etc., etc. I'm here. I'm more than happy. Gosh, I wish we were, I wish we were in class and I wish we were talking about this stuff because it's so, I mean, it's still great to be able to talk about books. I'm never gonna complain about talking about books, but it's just crummy to like not hear people's ideas back. I get to read them later, but man, like just think about talking about this stuff. I can't wait till we get to do that again. But yeah, if you want to come to my Zoom meetings, we can do that at least one-on-one and we can talk about the books. So if you need that fix, hit up my Zoom meetings. We can talk books all hour long or 2 hours, however long my Zooms are that day. All right. Well, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening, day, whatever it is. And I'll see you in cyberspace. Bye.